The sound of the armored vehicle moving over the beaten dirt roads spread through the rubble of Gaza. The voices of the Hamas soldiers emerged full of anxiety, inaudible to the soldiers inside the transport. They saw an easy target, a beast capable of killing them with a single shot, but one that was fragile when it was alone and blind. None of the soldiers inside the armored vehicle could notice that the men among the rubble were preparing the RPGs. The shot came from a weapon created by Hamas itself. It was the same one that the soldiers of the Islamic movement carried throughout Gaza. Jumping among the wreckage, walking through alleys where death sprayed its rotten perfume and war spread the stench of its acrid gunpowder sweat. This was how the battles between Israel and Hamas began inside Gaza City. Israel prepared its war machines around Gaza. There were dozens of tanks and armored transports under the Middle Eastern sun, waiting for orders to enter one of the most densely populated areas in the world. Men set up their ambushes among the vegetation, buildings, or rubble. They were just waiting for Israel to enter their territory and be completely destroyed or forced into a humiliating retreat, as Hezbollah had done before during the invasion of Lebanon. It seemed like the world had stopped because of the conflict between Israel and Palestine, to the point where people wondered if the war in Ukraine was over. But the truth is that, just as Russia continued its fight against Ukraine, Turkey and Iran kept denying the Kurds the opportunity for a state, with intense fighting still going on between Kurds and Turks. The conflict in Syria persisted, forcing more than 6 million people from their homes and making them resettle. Almost 3 million still remained in hard-to-reach besieged areas. By 2018, Russian bombings had killed more than 8,000 Syrian civilians. The Islamic State, a result of the disastrous American invasion of Iraq, was resurging. More than 1 million Rohingya without a state fled Myanmar after a genocide, coming to live in one of the largest refugee camps in the world near Bangladesh. But what the world wanted to know were the final intentions of the Israeli Defense Forces when surrounding Gaza. Defeating Hamas was too broad a goal when you consider that organization was embedded within the society of the Strip. It was a uniformed army that didn't mind taking off its wolf's skin to appear with pure white wool, blending into the environment. The protests against Israel continued in the major cities of the West. The movements were well organized, with influences from various groups. And it wasn't hard to move people or give them reasons to raise the flags. Israel's bombs kept falling on Gaza, taking the lives of civilians and fighters. When the cries of children were recorded and broadcast to the world, hatred grew and became focused, bringing people together. Hatred really does proliferate. In the Russian Federation, more precisely in the Republic of Dagestan, lynch mobs began to take over spaces in search of Jews. A man was crushed in the middle of a crowd, inflamed by rage and forced to prove that he was not Jewish, while his heart pounded, fearing the spark that would make the crowd explode in violence. The slightest rumor of a plane coming from Tel Aviv made protests invade the airport in a hunt. The authorities were forced to act, driving people away and arresting some. One of the great abilities of hatred is that, unlike love, it becomes reciprocal easily. In the United States, a 6-year-old child was stabbed to death simply because he was Muslim. A personal and painful crime in which there is a kind of hatred that makes a man not only commit the heinous act of attacking a child, but get so close as to touch him while taking his life. Such a horrible fact only showed the proliferation of an intimate hatred. The demons that fed on the fruits of the wave of anger and intolerance knew how to spread the seeds throughout the world so that they would sprout in people's hearts. From the hatred that tore a child's soul, excuses sprouted for a man in Belgium. Claiming to be part of the Islamic State, Abd Salim al-Gilani, 45 years old, fired randomly to kill 2 Swedes and injure 1 person. The next day, the authorities cornered him in a cafe. The man ended up dead on the way to the hospital, having already done the harm of sowing more hatred, leaving only the hope that the seeds he planted would not bear the fruit of a desire for revenge. Emotions were seen in different ways around the world. There was, for example, the cynicism and presumption of a man who was questioned about taking down posters of children kidnapped by Hamas. Families had already been contacted when the children were recognized. But when asked about his motivations for destroying the photos or about the Holocaust, the smile was clear on his face. It was the kind of hatred that will never be satisfied, with a peace that cannot exist as long as the lives of others are torn apart. In contrast, on the same program, a doctor born in Gaza who escaped misery gave a face to the victims of Israel's bombs, showing that those people were not just numbers, they had faces. And many of those faces were people he himself loved, members of his own family. He showed that each of his tears was a small drop reflecting memories of smiles, hugs, and caresses from loved ones lost when the flames engulfed them or when the houses turned into deadly concrete traps. It was a strange world where blurred lines turned war and the speed of information into instant spreaders of hatred. The Israeli Defense Forces entered Jenin once again for new clashes. Smoke filled the area, helping to blur the lines that define the rules of war, feelings, and information. The fighting continued with local militias responding to the Israeli soldiers. The conflicts intensified and men began to fall, some of them wounded and in need of immediate care. One of these strange events blurred in the fog of war occurred at that moment, when one of the doctors from the Red Crescent, the name for the Red Cross in many Islamic countries, committed a questionable act. Instead of providing medical care to the wounded, he prioritized running to the fallen fighter, grabbing his rifle and handing it to another militant during the shootout, knowing that because of his vest, the enemies would not shoot. Another equally absurd moment also happened in Jenin, when an Israeli soldier knelt behind one of the detained men, which practically made him a human shield. Even though at that moment everyone was exposed and there was no shooting, it was still a clear risk to a detained person under the responsibility of the state. The West Bank didn't have the same visibility as Gaza for many parts of the world, but death knew the place well and frequented the region with pleasure. On one occasion, it showed up when a 16-year-old Palestinian youth stabbed an Israeli border policewoman. The attacker ended up receiving gunshots in return, which made death take the opportunity to claim 2 souls on that trip. Many people have died in the West Bank since the horrors of October 7th. In one of the most striking scenes, the Israeli Defense Forces found a terrorist cell, part of one of the groups that carried out attacks from Tulkarm. The soldiers ambushed the militants' car and took cover behind another old vehicle. The M4 sights were aimed at the white car, where the targets were unable to protect themselves because they were caught by surprise and cornered. When they reacted, they ended up being targeted by rounds that were not silenced by the suppressors on the weapons, nor stopped by the car's thin metal body. The soldiers began a careful but assertive approach, using the necessary force to completely suppress the terrorist cell. The threat was eliminated, but the fighting in Jenin would persist. The invasion of Gaza by the Israel Defense Forces began on October 27th. The army had been preparing since the events of the 7th. Several countries were concerned about that option, including threats from Iran about a line to be crossed. Hezbollah, one of Iran's pawns in spreading chaos in the Middle East, had been attacking Israel. But, strangely, its leader released a video denying that they would enter into a full-scale war alongside Hamas, which caused some outraged reactions and disbelief. Israel sent messages to Gaza warning that everyone should move south to avoid further civilian casualties. Obviously, this caused even more chaos within an already miserable region. Rumors emerged that Hamas was blocking escape routes to keep human shields in Gaza. Convoys came under attack with explosions reported. Some said it was Israel, while other sources claimed it was Hamas itself. The information war continued endlessly. The Israeli troops began to march on two main fronts. One advanced from the north and the other started in the east and moved toward the coast. The Salah al-Din highway was used by armored vehicles to advance against the city of Gaza. The Israeli forces encountered their first difficulties when they accepted Hamas's invitation to a confrontation inside the Gaza Strip. Indeed, there were no bomb shelters for the population, but that organization skillfully used its resources to build tunnels and places for exchanges. They began to come out of their hideouts, moving through the densest vegetation and reaching the tanks without being detected. Their RPGs, manufactured by Hamas itself, the Al-Qassam and 105, had a caliber of 105 millimeters and could hit a tank at 300 meters. They didn't need all that distance. The men got close to the armored vehicles, almost to the point of touching them. In the middle of the vegetation, the militants advanced like ghosts in broad daylight to target the tanks. Sometimes they were so bold that they managed to get close and place the ammunition on the armored vehicle, then run away and detonate it with a shot from the Yasin. The Israelis served by fighting phantoms on the road. Stopping points where everything seemed calm suddenly turned into an ambush when the drones found the Israeli Defense Forces. The signal was given for the adversaries to come out of the tunnels with the Yasin in hand to start a new process to instill panic in the soldiers. This factor led to a victory for Hamas by making the army retreat on October 29th on Salah al-Din Road, and it proceeded but did not stop. The tactical retreat of the Israelis happened under the pressure of facing ghosts in their own territory. Hamas kept sending its soldiers into battle. Their tunnels and hideouts were an essential weapon to stop the Israeli advance. The Defense Forces troops quickly managed to resolve part of the situation. The bombs started falling on the tunnels, destroying the exits where the Palestinian militants crawled out for their ambushes. Even the well-designed structure for war couldn't withstand it, which left the Hamas soldiers trapped in their combat shelters. Obviously, such a complex and gigantic structure underground wouldn't be easily obliterated. Hamas kept coming out and ambushing the Israeli troops. The advance of the defense forces brought the conflict into the cities, starting intense urban combat. Now, you saw fewer fully uniformed soldiers, but more men dressed as civilians, carrying and aiming to strike. More armored vehicles. The losses of Israeli vehicles definitely happened. Individuals so capable of sneaking and setting up ambushes could easily film even more armored vehicles in flames, even if it was with drones. What we saw were impacts, and most likely not all of them resulted in the destruction of their targets for one reason: the TROF system. This defense consisted of a series of projectiles designed as countermeasures to annihilate imminent threats before they reached the target. These explosive protective countermeasures could be compared to high-caliber shotgun shell projectiles, ready to unleash a storm of explosive defense. Some of the unconfirmed explosions could therefore simply be the system in action. Mortars were another weapon used by Hamas to try to stop their adversaries who were getting closer and closer. Their shots came from well-camouflaged positions among trees or between buildings. The Israelis realized too late that the projectiles were falling. Soldiers died from the direct impact of mortars on their bodies, being torn apart by the force of the explosion. The fragments wounded the comrades around them. For these, all that was left was to wait for medical assistance that took them back home. Unit 669 went into action to rescue the wounded soldiers. Even during the intense Hamas gunfire, the cargo helicopter, 3C Stallion or utility helicopter, 60 Black Hawk helicopters landed on the hot terrain of Gaza. The wounded were taken into the aircraft, already prepared to receive proper medical treatment. A flight quickly took them to the nearest base. A Black Hawk was evacuating at almost 300 kilometers per hour. The helicopter also defended itself using M240 machine guns of 7.62 Emmy Mirigan and gun aircraft unit 19 of 12.7 millimeters. Some Hamas wells were found by Israeli soldiers. The worst part was that many of them were inside civilian areas. Their rocket launch hideouts were well camouflaged inside buildings or near rubble. As these positions were taken, the Israeli soldiers proceeded to destroy the tunnels. The sites were excavated to check their size and better calculate how much explosives would be needed to completely destroy the passage. Sometimes dogs were sent in to check for the presence of enemies. After all the data was ready, the explosions once again became part of the background noise of gas. The tanks were an important force in trying to destroy the enemy. The Merkava tanks used their 120mm cannons to destroy buildings and force Hamas troops out of their hiding places. The 12.7mm or 7.62mm machine guns attacked those who dared to get even closer in the dangerous battles. Israel ended up relying too much on the power of tanks. Very close together and clustered in the middle of the urban environment, the Merkava went from great combat beasts to mere 65-ton sheep being taken down by Yasin shots. So many tanks gathered together made maneuvers even more difficult. The Hamas soldiers ran among the rubble carrying their Yasin. The adrenaline of combat made the 7 kilograms they carried on their shoulders almost unnoticeable. They raised their sights at any glimpse of the tanks. A mere opening was enough for them to start firing among so many armored vehicles. After that, it was time to run, confirming the explosion without time to mark the kill. The rush through the rubble happened so many times that the blast of the RPGs became a symphony of terror in the ears of the Israelis. The tanks had nowhere to hide. Any distraction made them targets for rocket-propelled grenade teams. Hamas avoided direct confrontations as the bombs destroyed their leadership, and they found themselves having to fight, always using guerrilla tactics. The Israeli soldiers marched in line day and night to face them directly. Keeping the tanks without infantry meant certain destruction. The men took positions by entering the houses with Taver 5.56 rifles. The squads positioned themselves at the windows to cover the advance of the men who were beginning the direct confrontation with Hamas. The Taver rifle was an important weapon for the urban environment. Even though Israel had shorter M4 derivatives for confined environments, the bullpup model made it easier to maneuver in tight spaces, where it was necessary to move quickly and react even faster in order not to be killed. The Israeli advances also made way for the bulldozers, which destroyed tunnel entrances and possible enemy cover. The Hamas fighters split into even smaller groups, sometimes with records from other organizations. Wearing nothing but civilian clothes, they carried RPGs, looking for gaps in the infantry to find any tank that was still unprotected. There were always watchful eyes at the corners ready to be put in the sights. The men moved quickly through the rubble of Gaza. The main weapon was the rocket-propelled grenade as they jumped from one spot to another or ran to new hiding places after hitting a tank. Waiting for the right moment was essential. The Israeli soldiers depended on seeing the enemy and were deaf to the advance that almost always ended with a crash against the armor of a tank. That territory did not tolerate distraction. Some of the more careless soldiers at the windows were quickly spotted by the enemies. Hamas was always armed and had eyes everywhere. The Israelis became the next victims of the Yasin, disappearing under smoke and rubble. The anti-tank squads could move and maneuver quickly, but they needed to regroup at some point to get ammunition and supplies. Israel kept surveillance over many areas. When they found some of these groups, they sent the planes into action. The final rest of these soldiers happened under fire, ending their mission permanently. All of Hamas's efforts did not prevent Israel from entering Gaza City. Aden's bombs kept falling, demolishing buildings that posed a high risk to the soldiers or were enemy outposts. The shells fell in succession at the base of the buildings, bringing everything down on top of them and burying any attempt at resistance. The infantry kept pushing forward through the smoke and rubble that hid the flesh from which death had already relieved the souls. The soldiers moved across the open ground marked by the tracks of tanks and bulldozers. Everyone was supposed to find defensive positions, with squads at the windows providing cover for the men who risked themselves in the open field. The tanks accompanied the infantry in the same way, and with them inevitably came the explosions that destroyed Hamas hideouts. The Israeli soldiers moved closer to areas where explosions and airstrikes had weakened the resistance. One of them was an amusement park where there were tunnels used by Islamic fighters. The barrels of the guns threatened the darkness without encountering resistance. The explosives were set to be detonated later by a signal from a safe distance. The speculation was that Hamas used the heavy movement in the park to disguise the arrival of weapons and men. That was not the only time the Israelis found enemy bases inside civilian areas. The fighters climbed the skeletons of buildings where only the ghosts of families now roamed in the form of small memories. They were children's rooms with dolls and the simple pink of a girl, in contrast to a room where drones were assembled, protective vests were stored, and ammunition was stocked. Until November 12th, the fighting was fierce in Gaza. Israel continued to demand the evacuation of civilians, creating corridors so that people could leave the conflict areas. The line of refugees forced to move because of the war was one of humanity's eternal sorrows. Civilians who were already living in misery in one of the most densely populated areas in the world saw their hopes being crushed. It was little more than nothing between a rock and a hard place. On one side, there was the political and military organization they voted for to lead them, but which never spent a cent to provide them with shelters and protection. And they took away precious resources sent by other countries to use exclusively for the war. On the other side, there was a state that dropped bombs on cities, where the enemies were chameleons among a desperate population. Both sides justified themselves morally by talking about normal casualties in a war or the right to kill because of oppression, which did nothing to change the fact that the guardian angels had abandoned Gaza, leaving only angels of death already exhausted from their work, and demons enriched with the most precious treasures minted by war, misery, and hatred.